All right, welcome back, everybody. In this video, we're going to cover some of the basic elements of the scientific method, as well as some classic research methods that are found in not just the social sciences, but science in general. And the important thing to consider is that the statistical analyses you will learn this semester are found all over in terms of the scientific method. And so understanding the different types of research methods, as well as how the process of the scientific method works, is going to allow you to better implement the statistics in this course, as well as, once again, being a better consumer of statistical information. So it all begins with the scientific method, which is a systematic process of gathering evidence before making decisions. And at least that's how I think about it. So the idea is we are, asked to make decisions all the time, and the best thing we can do is use our rational brain, which means, relying on evidence as opposed to intuition. Because sometimes intuition is wrong. We are often surprised that the world doesn't always work the way we expected it to. So the scientific method is arguably unbiased, or at least it attempts to be unbiased. It tries to gather evidence in a very deliberate and systematic manner so that we make the most reliable and valid decisions about the world. So we'll get more specific in a moment, but let's start off with some key terms. The first is theory. And a theory is basically an organized understanding of some phenomena. So my theory might be that sleep is important for getting good grades in school. I think that students who get better sleep are going to have better grades. Now, in order for me to gather evidence to, in favor or against this theory, I need to test that theory, and that's where a hypothesis comes in. A hypothesis is a more specific and testable form of my theory. So a hypothesis might be if I have two groups of students and one group sleeps more than 8 hours a night and the other group sleeps less than 8 hours a night, there would be a difference on GPA between these two groups. So it's not a perfect study, but the idea is I've taken my theory, which is general and abstract, simply saying sleep is related to grades, and I've made it much more specific and testable. Now, when it comes to testing hypotheses, this is where we can look at three classic research designs or research methods. And this is the basic of any science. So it all starts off with description. This is the starting point to any science. So if I don't know enough information about a topic, the first thing you want to do is describe as much as you know. So making observations, interviewing people, giving people surveys. Descriptive research is great because it's simply a method of gathering information about some topic. So for example, maybe Pierce College does a descriptive study where they simply count the number of Pierce students who drive to campus. And so they want to know, for example, do we have enough parking spaces? Which probably they don't. But the idea is they're simply describing a population of people, which is how many people drive to campus. It's not wildly complex, but it's important, and it's a way of gathering important information. Now, typically, more advanced research involves correlational or experimental research. And so let's talk about those. The basic takeaway that I want to cover is what each are defined as, but then more importantly, sort of the strengths and weaknesses of each. So correlation is where you measure two variables to see if they have a relationship with each other. And so, for example, Let's look at this article right here. The title of this article is Study Reveals Correlation Between Exercise and Good Grades. And so this is some journalist report from some study conducted in Colorado, where they found that students who exercised more tended to have better grades. So essentially, they found a relationship between those two variables. But the important concept to consider is that correlation does not imply causation. So just because students who exercised more got better grades, it does not mean that exercise is causing better grades. And we'll talk about why in a moment. But essentially, what they found was simply that those students who reported higher amounts of exercise also reported higher grades, and vice versa. Lower exercise, those students tended to report lower grades. But the key idea here is that it's a tendency, it's a pattern, and it is not necessarily a causal relationship. So it's possible, for example, that students who have a conscientious personality, who have a really motivated personality, are the types of students who are going to exercise, and those conscientious people are also more likely to study and therefore get good grades. So we call this the third variable problem. The idea that in a correlational study, just because two variables are correlated, you can't rule out the fact that some third variable might actually be causing each of those two to change. So the advantage of a correlational study, as you're going to see later this semester when you actually conduct correlational analyses, the advantage is it's rather simple because it only involves measurement. But the major disadvantage is you cannot talk about causal relationships. Does X cause Y? If you want to look at causal relationships, you must conduct an experiment. An experiment is the gold standard because it allows you to look at cause and effect. And so let's look at an example of an experiment. Imagine a researcher wants to compare two teaching methods to see how it affects students' grades. And so the first teaching method is just a lecture only. And the second teaching method is a lecture with a lab component. And so the idea is that you have two groups of people. One group receives the first treatment, the lecture only, and the second group receives the second treatment, the lecture and the lab. And if there's a difference in their grades, you have some reason to believe that it was the differences in how they were treated that caused the differences in their grades. So for example here, what we see is that students who had the lecture and the lab component, they also had higher grades compared to students who only had the lecture only. So it's reasonable to expect that it was the different teaching method that caused an outcome difference in grades. But we have some further clarifications to make. So you have some key terms here. The first is the independent variable, the second is the confounding variable, and the third is the dependent variable. Let's define each. The independent variable is the predictor variable. It's the one that the researcher manipulates. In other words, the researcher makes it different in one group compared to another. So the independent variable in this study was the teaching method. One group received a lecture only, and the other group received a lecture with a lab. That's the independent variable manipulated between two groups. The dependent variable, let's go to the bottom. The dependent variable is the outcome. This is the effect. This is the idea that we think the independent variable might cause a difference in the dependent variable. The dependent variable in this study is grades. And what we're trying to see is the dependent variable dependent on the independent variable? Now, finally, in order for us to claim that the independent variable causes a change in the dependent variable, the only thing that can be different between your two groups is the independent variable. However, we have a confounding variable in this study. So the first group, they received their teaching from Professor Smith. And the second group received their teaching from Professor Jones. The problem to consider is we don't know why the second group had higher grades than the first group, because there's two possibilities. Possibility number one is that they received the lecture with the lab component, and it's possible that the lab component sort of adds to their understanding of the course and increases their grades. But the second possibility is that there's something about Professor Jones. Perhaps Professor Jones is a better teacher than Professor Smith, and therefore we don't know what caused the higher grades. So the fact that there's different professors, this is known as a confounding variable. The differences in the professors confounds the researcher's ability to understand cause and effect. So essentially, you don't want confounding variables in your study. You only want the independent variable to be the only variable that is different between your two groups. Otherwise, you cannot discuss cause and effect. But finally, one thing to consider about the experiment is that if it's the only way to discuss cause and effect, why would anyone ever do a correlational study? And there's two primary reasons. The first is ethics. It's not always ethical to conduct an experiment. For example, if I wanted to know, does homelessness cause mental disorder? The way I would do that experiment is to take a group of individuals and have one group become homeless and the other group not become homeless to see if there's a difference in their outcomes in terms of mental health. But clearly it's unethical to ask people to become homeless for the sake of research. So instead I would have to do a correlational study. I would have to see if, for example, do homeless people tend to have higher amounts of mental illness compared to those who are not homeless? But because I did a correlational study, I cannot necessarily talk about cause and effect. So the downside to an experiment is that you can't always conduct an experiment ethically. And the second is that experiments are more time consuming and they're often more, they cost more money because you're actually setting up various conditions, and that takes more time and often more effort and more money. So as a result, correlational studies are often used simply because they're more practical. But experiments are the gold standard because you can only talk about cause and effect through an experiment. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is the concept of statistical significance versus sampling error. So let's look at this slide here. We have a population of first grade students who are split into two groups, sample A and sample B. And what's happening here is that each group is receiving a different teaching method. And so we want to know, do the differences in their teaching method affect the differences in their grades? And so if you look at step 2, you can see that on average, sample A scored higher. Their average was 76 compared to sample B, which was an average of 71. Now, obviously 76 is a higher number than 71, but what's important to think about, and this is something that is really an important takeaway for most of the class, and the question is, why is there a difference in those two numbers? So 76 is obviously higher than 71, and there's two possible reasons for that. The first is that there's a statistically significant effect brought about by the differences in teaching method. Or put differently, teaching method A is simply better than teaching method B, and therefore students who were in group A got higher grades because the teaching method was better than those in teaching method B. So we call that a statistically significant effect. And what that means is that if you were to take another group of students, a different group of students, and divide them into two groups, A and B, again, you would expect group A to score higher than group B because it is a statistically significant effect in the sense that method A is better than method B. The second possibility is that there is no difference between method A and method B, but instead, the reason group A scored higher was because of sampling error. And so think about this. It's possible that through random selection, group A happened to have students who are simply smarter than those in group B. And therefore, the reason sample A scored higher on average than sample B had nothing to do with the fact that teaching method A was different than teaching method B. It simply had to do with the fact that students in group A were smarter to begin with. And therefore, we don't know, why is 76 higher than 71? Why did group A score higher on average than group B? Two possibilities. Statistical significance, in other words, there's a meaningful difference between groups A and group B, the teaching methods, or there is no meaningful difference, it's simply sampling error. So how do you decide which of those two possibilities is actually the case? That's what this class is all about. We are going to learn statistical analyses that help us understand which of those two outcomes is more likely. And that's how we figure out lots of different things in our society. So for one, medication. Why do we take medication as opposed to not taking medication? Well, arguably, researchers have evaluated the effects of medication using statistics and determined that they are effective. And we will actually talk about how that works. We'll talk about, for example, let's talk about politics. So exit polls. We can determine, whether or not candidate A or candidate B is going to win the election based on a sample of voters. So these research methods they're found in all areas of science, and we're going to touch upon them in this course so that we can learn how the scientific method applies to various social sciences, and of course how statistical analyses are involved.